afternoon, everyone. I'm glad that I'm here. Also, I would have preferred in person, but but that's the whole virtual world that we're living in now. So today I'm going to talk about the slurries of complex fluids, and this is the outline of my talk. I'll start with introducing the concept of the slurries of complex fluids and their applications in their significance and applications in natural and industrial settings. Then I'm going to talk about how we can establish scaling laws for them. And finally, if time allows, I'm going to talk about a couple of industrial problems and show how we can use our understanding in rheology and fluid mechanics to address these problems. So slurries of complex fluids or non-Newtonian slurries, in many natural and industrial applications, we are dealing with dense suspensions. And by that, I mean suspensions of particles with a wide range of size that span from colloidal to non-colloidal, non-Brownian particles in a viscous liquid. So the examples include mud that we have in mudslide, landslide, submarine avalanches, nuclear waste, concrete, many hygiene products. So many biological fluids actually can think of mucus and bacteria and so on and so forth. So in all of these examples, the fine colloidal particles interact to form a complex fluid or non-Newtonian fluid, which itself drags along larger non-Brownian particles. And this is what I mean by the concept of non-Newtonian slurries or complex slurries. So to just give you a couple of examples about the significance of such materials. So here in this slide, I'm showing the mudslide that occurred in close to Santa Barbara. After a period of heavy rainfall season, a large volume of soil mixed with water, a lot of water due to the rain, and that caused the soil to be liquefied and move down the hill. And as a result of this tragedy, dozens of people died. Hundreds of homes got destroyed, and I was visiting the University of Santa Barbara at the time, and I remember it took them 1 month to clear the Highway 101. So when this kind of tragedy occurs, we ask this question that can we predict the initiation, runout, and the flow dynamics of mudslide to avoid or reduce the impact of natural disasters? And as I said, mud belongs to the category of complex slurries. So understanding its rheology and flow dynamics is important for natural disasters. Another example is about a concrete industry. So as I said, concrete is a non-Newtonian slurry, and the mixture of cement and sand and gravel and water produces concrete. And cement production itself is the source of about 8% of carbon dioxide emission on Earth. So which is bad news. And to reduce the amount of cement that is required to produce concrete, the concrete industry add sand and gravel and ash and fillers to the concrete. But the problem is the slurry of cement plus additives is more viscous than the cement slurry itself, and that brings challenges for industry when they want to mix and pump concrete in large amount. And I'm going to come back to this slide and provide some resolution after we show the scaling arguments and the fluid mechanics of such problems. On the energy front, one example is hydraulic fracturing. So we know that in the US, 50% of the oil and gas production is the outcome of hydraulic fracturing, in which an engineered suspensions of fracturing fluid and proppant and sand is pumped into the reservoir with high pressure and rate. The idea is to create fractures in the reservoir, and when the pressure is released, the grains of particles are left behind, and the hydrocarbon can flow through this porous medium. And that enhances the efficiency of the reservoir. But how we can do better? So recent trends in oil industry has included the addition of the proppant or sand and gravels to the fracturing fluid in a cyclic fashion. And the idea is to transport these pillars of particles or pulses of particles into the reservoir and support the fracture with these porous pillars instead of a continuous porous medium. So the idea is that in this scenario, hydrocarbon not only can flow through the porous pillars, but also through the spacing between them, and that enhances the efficiency of reservoir substantially. But the question is that, so we know that if we add a pulse of particle into a flowing fluid, it's not going to stay like that, as it and it is going to disperse. So the question is that, what is this dispersion? And can we come up with a pumping schedule or a new design for the rheology of fracturing fluid to be able to limit the dispersion and to be able to transport these pillars of particles to the reservoir to come up with an architecture that we want, and that leads to the maximum efficiency of the reservoir. So I'm going to come back to this slide again and provide some solution. So in all of these problems and applications that I've introduced, we have to tackle three fundamental steps to solve them. So for example, if I want to understand the dispersion of solid in a fracturing problem, I have to write down the second law of Newton for the non-Newtonian slurries or the complex slurries. And to be able to close the governing equation of motion, I need to know what is the rheology of this material. Namely, what is the response of the material to the applied shear stress and normal forces? And if I want to control, for example, the dispersion of these pulses of particles or non-Newtonian slurries, I need to understand what is the link between the rheology and the underlying microstructure or the configuration of the particles inside. So today I'm going to talk about rheology mainly, and maybe fluid mechanics, and I would love to discuss microstructure if you're interested in. That brings me to the second part of the talk. What is the rheology of such materials, how they respond and how they deform to an applied shear stress and normal stress, and how can we establish a scaling laws or constitutive laws for them. So this is the problem. As I mentioned, in reality, we have suspensions of particles with a wide range of sizes in a viscous liquid. And you can see that the key variables are density ratio between the particle phase and solid phase, the particle size, so we have polydispersity, the particle shape, so I'm showing everything here, but by spheres, but they in reality, they have random shape, they're not spherical. And of course, we have polydispersity size distribution, and they have the solid volume fraction that might change. And also, if you think about the forces that are involved here, we have contact interactions between the particles. We have hydrodynamic interactions between the viscous liquid and particles, and we have colloidal forces on the surface of the particles. So it's just the space of parameters is vast, as you can see, and establishing a scaling laws is very challenging here. So what I want to do, I want to simplify the problem, and I want to say that suppose that we have just fine colloidal particles in the system. What is the rheology of such system? And suppose that we have large non-colloidal particles in a viscous liquid. What is the rheology of this system? And can I make use of our understanding in these two fields and combine the result to come up with the scaling laws that explain the rheology of complex slurries? So this is my goal today. Suppose that there are just fine colloidal particles in the system, and we know that from colloidal science that these particles interact with hydrodynamic, contact, and surface forces to form a substrate that its rheology can be expressed by non-Newtonian laws, generalized Newtonian laws, for example, shear thinning, shear thickening, and yield stress pulleys, or viscoelastic laws. And in this talk, we're going to focus on generalized Newtonian laws. So by that, we know that if there was no colloidal particle in the solvent, the viscosity is constant as a function of shear rate. That's a Newtonian material. So when we have shear thinning material, it means that as we shear the material, the viscosity drops, or it can be, the rheology can be shear thickening, meaning that the interaction of colloidal forces, contact, and other forces in the system would give me a rheology that the viscosity increases as a function of shear rate. So the example of shear thickening material is concrete. The example of shear thinning material is it can be mud, but also there is a possibility that the material exhibits a yield stress, meaning that below a threshold in a stress, there is no deformation, and above that material deforms like a shear thinning pulley. Again, example is mud, because mud always exhibits a yield stress. That's why when there is an instability in the soil due to human activities or rain or so many other things, we destabilize that, and then we impose a stress that goes above the threshold, and that is yield stress, and then there is a flow. So this is our knowledge from colloidal science, that the fine colloidal particles can interact and give us this rheology. And you can see that in this framework, the viscosity is not constant, and it is a function of shear rate. So, so this is what we know, and now I want to give a quick overview about the rheology of large non-Brownian particles in a viscous liquid when we impose shear rate. So in this case, the background fluid is Newtonian, and there is no colloidal forces on the surface of particles. So the particles interact with hydrodynamic and contact forces and friction. So suppose that I imposed some shear rate on this material. So because of that, shear stresses and normal stresses develop in the material. And the presence of normal stress is just because particles should move around each other. And this is totally, the origin of this normal stress is just due to the particles and the configuration in the system, and it doesn't have anything anything to do with relaxation times, like viscoelastic fluids, because we kind of excluded all of the fine colloidal interaction here. So if I want to come up with a scaling law for shear stresses and normal stresses here, we can say that in the absence of inertia, everything is viscous. So shear stress should depend linearly with shear rate, and of course the viscosity of suspending fluid. And in order to take into account the fact that the particles are rigid and there is no deformation, and we have extra dissipation here in the system, and also extra dissipation due to the fact that they have contact and friction among themselves. So we can basically code all of this interaction into a function or multiplier that I'm going to call it relative shear viscosity, and this is a function of solid volume fraction. And the larger the solid volume fraction, the larger the dissipation. So this is how we do. But the main key is that everything is viscous, and the only available scaling is viscous scaling here. And we can have the same argument for the normal stresses that are developed in this suspension, in this system. And now we can just adopt a different multiplier that we call normal relative viscosity. So there is a long history of research behind calculating the relative shear and normal viscosities in non-Brownian and suspensions of Newtonian fluids. And this the theory actually started by Einstein. And this picture summarizes all of the available experimental, theoretical, and computational research. So here you're looking at a plot of the relative shear viscosity as a function of the solid volume fraction. And you can see that I can really summarize all of these results into this key message. So the relative shear viscosity, as we expect, is an increasing function of solid volume fraction. And it seems that it diverges at a critical volume fraction that I'm denoting it by phi m, and this is a maximum jamming volume fraction that I have in the system. And I want to draw your attention to this divergence here. As you can see that the small change in the solid volume fraction of the particles close to this phi m results in a huge variation in the relative shear viscosity. And basically, it's been shown that we have the same divergence for the normal shear viscosity. So this is what we know about in Newtonian suspensions when there is no inertia, and how we can scale the shear stresses and normal stresses in the suspension. So now let's turn to our main question. So our main question is that I have a system that is really composed of a wide range of sizes of particles, and some of the particles have fine colloidal interaction on their surface and some not. And we assume that we're going to look at this in a very simple fashion, and that is we're going to say that the fine colloidal particles interact to form a non-Newtonian matter here, which itself drags along larger non-Brownian particles. And the question is that what happens if I deform this material? What are the shear stresses and normal stresses, and how I can establish a scaling laws here? Again, you can think about this, that in the absence of inertia, the only scaling is viscous scaling. So I can write down the shear stress as the viscosity of the fluid times shear rate. And I can assume that in dense regime of particles, everything is in dense regime of suspensions, that there are lots of particles, everything is controlled by contact interaction So I can adopt the same relative shear and normal viscosities as that of Newtonian fluid. That's one assumption that we can have. But there is another thing that we don't have any knowledge here, and that is as follows. We know that now, unlike the previous example, that the particles were suspended in a Newtonian fluid, now the fluid, the background fluid, is a colloid, and the viscosity of colloid is a function of shear rate. So what shear rate? As we add these large particles into a system of liquid, particles see a variation in the velocity, a local variation in the velocity that is really different from the average shear rate over a larger neighborhood. I'm going to show that local shear rate by this gamma dot local. And again, I want to argue that if the dynamics of particle is mainly controlled by the geometry and the solid volume fraction, then we can say that this local shear rate depends on the average shear rate via a geometric, through a geometric function that I'm going to call it f, and that function just depends on phi. So if I make all of these assumptions, then I can say that this viscosity basically at the this is the viscosity that is seen by the particles. And because viscosity in colloids depend on the shear rate, this is the viscosity of the local shear rate that is seen by the particles that I have to use here. And with that, we can close this scaling clause. So, and now the next question is that, so I made all of these assumptions, how we can test them. So two assumptions that I made here about that I'm allowed to make the same relative shear and normal viscosities as Newtonian suspensions, and another assumption that I made that the viscosity is really the viscosity that is seen locally by the particles, and that depends on this local shear rate that is again a function of the solid volume fraction. So to test these assumptions, what we are doing now, we want to load our suspension in a setup that is homemade, and we call it pressure imposed rheometry. And what is this setup about? We have an annulus that we load some suspensions here, and on top we have a plate that is perforated and we push on the suspension. So what we do, we impose normal stress and we deform the material, and we allow the system, we allow this plate to move vertically to adjust its volume fraction by the particle stress, because it's perforated, fluid can move freely, so there is no pressure on the fluid, but we have pressure on the particle face. So again, what we do, we apply this normal stress and shear rate, and we measure the shear stress and what is the final volume fraction in this system. So we have used many different suspensions, Newtonian suspensions of Newtonian viscous liquid and particles, and suspensions of yield stress fluid with different yield stresses. And we want to basically test our hypothesis. So the first hypothesis that I made was that I'm allowed to use the same relative shear and normal viscosities as that of Newtonian suspension. And if this is true, if I divide the shear stress by the normal stress, you can see that I'm left with this ratio, and this is called in the granular media macroscopic friction coefficient, and it's just the ratio of the normal, the macroscopic shear stress to normal stress. And if this is true, if my assumption was true, it shouldn't depend on the type of suspending fluid, and all of the data for different type of suspending fluid should overlap. And you can see that's in fact the case. So for different type of suspending fluid, it seems that this friction coefficient does not depend on the type of suspending fluid, but mainly the geometrical constraint that we have in the system. So that's the first hypothesis that we have verified. The second is that if am I allowed to link the local shear rate to the average shear rate by a function that just depends on geometry? And then again, we have measured that for a variety of materials, and this is all of our results that kind of overlap on a master curve, and it shows that this geometric function f just depends on the solid volume fraction. It does not depend on the type of suspending fluid. So there are a couple of side slides that I'll talk about if there were any questions. But we have tested our scaling arguments for a variety of different suspensions. And by that, I mean a variety of different type of suspending fluid and particles. And today I'm just going to show some of our results that's about how the rheology of suspensions of particles in a shear thickening material can be scaled with the scaling laws. So in this picture, you are looking at the micrograph of cornstarch grains. So so this is the oobleck, and I'm sure many of people have experimented with that. So this is a milky suspension, and if you stir it, you can stir it very slowly. But then if you want to stir it fast, it's like that you're really pushing on solid. So that and I showed the rheological behavior that viscosity rises as a function of shear rate. But if you look at this system of oobleck or cornstarch in water under microscope, this is what you see. So the grains of cornstarch are polydisperse. They are not spherical, the shape is random, and the size varies from actually 5 micron to 13 micron. So now if you add a different amount or solid volume fraction of cornstarch in water, and you sandwich it between 2 plates, and you start shearing or rotating the top plate and calculating the viscosity from that, you can see that depending on the solid volume fraction of cornstarch, you would have different behavior. So initially, the material acts like a shear thinning liquid, and it exhibits a plateau at some point, and then the viscosity rises. And depending on what the solid volume fraction of cornstarch in your system is, at some point there is a huge jump in the viscosity. And we call it discontinuous shear thickening, versus that behavior that is a continuous rise in viscosity, and we call it a continuous shear thickening. So we have this system, and to give you why there is such a behavior, this is the to date basically theory, and that's as follows. For this particular material, when we have these grains of cornstarch in water, there is a repulsive force at the surface of these particles that prevent the particles to come into contact with each other. So when we shear this material, there is no contact initially. It's like that you have a system of particles, frictionless particles in a viscous liquid that move around each other. But as you increase the rate of shear, or as you increase the stress equivalently in your system, at some point the stress becomes larger than normal repulsive stress between the grains, and that brings the particles into contact. And then at that point, friction becomes activated, and you know that friction is a highly dissipating force, and that's the reason that you get a huge jump in the viscosity in such materials. So basically, the balance of repulsive force and shear stress would give you a critical shear rate or critical time scale in the problem, if you wish. So now the question is that I want to understand if my scaling law would predict the behavior of such suspensions if I start adding larger non-Brownian particles into that. And the reason that I'm doing that is back to the beginning of the talk that I talked about the mixture of cement and sand and gravel that would produce concrete. Cement is a shear thickening material, and you can experiment with cornstarch, and that would give you the same behavior. So basically, if I understand what happens if I add these large non-Brownian particles into the oobleck, it is a model, I shouldn't say model suspension, but it is an equivalent system of concrete that we can understand that behavior. So I start with a system of cornstarch in water that the suspension exhibits shear thickening, discontinuous shear thickening. And then I add large non-Brownian particles. And by large, I mean that the size is about 20 times larger than the 20 times and more larger than the grain of cornstarch. So basically, these large particles look at the suspension of oobleck or cornstarch in water as a continuum. So now I start adding these large particles into the system, and we can see that the viscosity here rises. That we know why, because I introduced the concept of relative shear and normal viscosity, and I said that the viscosity depends on the solid volume fraction. So that's what why these curves shift would move upward actually. But another interesting thing is that as I add particles into the system, the critical shear rate moves to the left. So there is a smaller shear rate that this jump, there is a smaller average shear rate that this jump happens. And that, again, we can explain it with the scaling laws that I just introduced. And the reason is that when we add these larger particles into the system, we increase the local shear rate. And if the repulsive force should balance the shear stresses in the suspension for that friction to become activated and that jump to happen, now that occurs at a local shear rate, not at the average shear rate, and the average shear rate associated with the critical local shear rate obviously is smaller as we add more and more particles. So I think that's the whole conclusion of the whole story so far, is that we learned from our knowledge from colloidal science that the viscosity of suspending fluid with a particulate system with colloidal interaction depends on the shear rate, and then we can bring that knowledge to understand how we can scale particles in a larger particles in a non-Newtonian framework. It seems that geometrical constraint is the critical thing, and we can come up with the scaling laws that are viscous in the absence of inertia. All we have to take into account is that the viscosity of the fluid is now the viscosity that is seen by the particles, so the local viscosity. And we could basically use this scaling law to explain how and why the rheology of the suspensions of large non-Brownian particles in a generalized Newtonian fluid, which is the oobleck or cornstarch suspension, varies like that. So we get an enhancement in the viscosity, and that enhancement basically happens at a smaller and smaller shear rate. So if you think about it, this is very critical in concrete industry, because if you want to build a huge instruction, you don't really want to have to see such an enhancement in the viscosity, and also that would limit your mixing capability if really at the smaller and smaller shear rate you would get a huge jump in viscosity. It means that mixing would be an issue. So I'm going to pause here And I would love to take questions, if any, before proceeding with the next part of my talk.
I think we can leave the questions at the end because we have like 10 minutes or so for the talk, and then go for questions.
Oh, okay.
If
So
that's okay.
Sure. So I just have 10 more minutes?
More or less. And then questions. So.
Okay. So I'm just going to talk about the second part of the talk, and then but well, I cut some of this, so and I'll pause. So the third part, I'm going to talk about the application. So one huge problem in concrete industry is as follows. So basically, cement or concrete, they behave like a continuous shear thickening material. So and the rheological behavior is similar to the cornstarch suspension in water that I just introduced. So when you add particles, large particles, sand and gravel and ash and fillers into the system, they see that there is a huge jump in the rheology, or huge change in the rheology from something that behaves like a continuous shear thickening to a discontinuous shear thickening. So if you think about this, I cannot really explain this behavior with the with the scaling laws that I've just introduced. And the reason is that when I talked about the scaling laws, all I did was bringing the concept of enhancement of the viscosity because of the increase of the solid volume fraction and change in the local shear rate. But in that way of thinking about the problem, there is no jump from one rheological behavior to another rheological behavior. So if I have a material that behaves like this black line, if I keep adding particles into that, all should happen is just this black line should shift upward, and also I can shift this kind of the rise should occur at different shear rate now because my local shear rate is different. But the whole shape should remain invariant and should not show such a different, let's say, behavior. But also, when I talked about the suspension of cornstarch in water or oobleck, I said that as we increase the particles in the system, the grains of cornstarch in the system, at some point, I transition from continuous shear thickening to the discontinuous shear thickening. So what happens when So it tells me that when I add these large non-Brownian particles into the system, something happens that the volume fraction of these small grains would change. And we can think of it as this. So imagine that I have these suspensions of grains or cornstarch in water, and then I keep adding these large non-Brownian particles in the system. And if I do so, I know that these small grains cannot come closer than their radius to the surface of these large particles. So there is a shell around these large particles that the volume fraction of cornstarch drops. However, I know that the total volume fraction of cornstarch or a small grain is constant. So this drop at this shell should end up with rise in solid volume fraction somewhere else, because the number of these grains are conserved. It's constant. So we can easily write down or find a function that would give me what is the rise, what is the solid volume fraction outside this shell, or the rise of solid volume fraction outside this shell as a function of solid volume fraction of the small grains, solid volume fraction of these large particles, and the diameter of these large particles. So I'm going to call that solid volume fraction, an effective solid volume fraction. And to test if this is true really, this is an experiment that we've designed. So we can, based on the formula that we have, we can plot the color map of the effective solid volume fraction in the plane of the initial solid volume fraction of cornstarch or cement in the material, and also the solid volume fraction of large particles in the material. So if I look at the concentration, the rheology of the small grains in water with no large particles, as I showed, there is a transition from continuous shear thickening to discontinuous shear thickening, and this transition occurs at a solid volume fraction of cornstarch that is about 38%. So if I plot the ISO line of 38% here, what it tells me is that anything below this, anything to the left should be continuous shear thickening, and anything above this line should be discontinuous shear thickening. So to test that, this is what we did. We prepared a very dilute suspension of cornstarch in water with no large particles in that, and we measured the rheology. You can see that this is here, so that the solid volume fraction of the large particles is 0, and the solid volume fraction of the small grains or cornstarch is about 35%. So we can see there is a very slight rise in viscosity, so we are in continuous shear thickening regime. So now we keep adding large particles into that, and you can see that as I keep adding large particles into that, the viscosity rises, but I'm still in the continuous shear thickening regime. And as soon as I pass this line, the material behaves like a discontinuous shear thickening, and I pass this line and the material behaves like a discontinuous shear thickening. So basically, when we add these large particles into the system, due to those excluded volume that I introduced, the solid volume fraction of the small grains locally would increase somewhere else, and it results in this discontinuous shear thickening. And of course, you can come up with the idea that how it depends on the size of the larger particles that you add. And then, so we did that, and we came up basically for a resolution we came up with a resolution for concrete industry that if they want to operate in a regime that the mixing and pumping wouldn't be affected, they have to really stay in this continuous shear thickening regime, and this is how they should vary their particle diameter or the initial volume fraction of the cement. Well, that was just one example of how these materials or slurries or complex fluids behave. And as I said, we excluded inertia, we excluded the effect of shape, we excluded the fact that these constitutive laws are in fact tensorial. So these are, we have studied adding different things into the system, and we are moving toward establishing a tensorial framework that would encode all of these informations. So I think I will stop here because I wanted to talk about fluid mechanics of the problem, but I think this is I'm going to run out of time. So thank you very much for your attention. This is my references. So if I want to summarize, I just established a scaling laws, and I showed that how we can make use of this concept of excluded volumes or confinement, if you wish, to understand those more complex behaviors that happen in these systems. And I want to acknowledge the graduate students, undergraduate students who were on board for the results that I showed, and also the collaborators that I've had, a mentor, and the funding agencies. thank you very much for your attention. I would be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and it's good to see the progress of the work. And if anybody has a question, you can raise your hand or ask the question on the chat, or yeah, so it's up to you. But while we have any other question coming in, I'm curious. Well, my first, and this is basic, and I should know this, but it's non-Brownian particles, because you can, if you wanted, you could actually model how each particle moves, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference, or does it have to do with the fluid that you are putting it in?
They are non-Brownian. I mean that they are large enough that they are not affected by the thermal agitation in the system.
Okay, so that's
more
okay.
Than 1 micron size.
Okay, so but then even the particles in the oblong on the fluid, those are non-Brownian too?
No, the fine particles are Brownian. So then what I assume is that those fine colloidal particles that are in fact Brownian particles, so they have thermal interactions, but the thermal interactions, hydrodynamic interactions, and contact interactions in those would give me a rheology that is the generalized Newtonian, and that can be yield stress, shear thinning, and shear thickening. So I'm going to assume that rheology, and then now I add these large non-Brownian particles into that.
Okay, so that's how you, so yes. Because you don't model each, you don't simulate each particle, right? Of course, the experiments, you are doing the whole thing, but when you do the simulation, you do it with a generalized non-Newtonian model.
Yes, so yeah, that I've done some simulations, but because if you think about it, it's a very, if you want to come up with a system of viscous fluid plus a wide range of particle size that kind of pictures this complex slurries, it's very challenging, because you're talking about nanometer size fine colloidal particles up to millimeter size large non-Brownian particles, and you want to have a centimeter or meter of this kind of thing. So yeah, the integration of the length scales is really huge, and it's impossible. So the assumption is that, well, let's say that those fine colloidal particles interact, and we know what is the rheology. And now I assume this rheology, whatever it is, shear thinning, thickening, yield stress, viscoelastic, and then I add larger non-Brownian particles, and what happens now.
And then you said some of the motivation for the work was these mudslides in California, or in general. So what can you do to control the mudslide? So
yeah, good question.
You say it was a motivation, so it's like how what's the relationship? Yes.
Yeah. So I think the idea is the idea there is that if I would know what is the rheology of the material, I would have an understanding of how the yield stress of such material changes by the amount of solid volume fraction that I have. So when there is a rain or some kind of perturbation, when we are going to pass that threshold in a stress that is yield stress for the whole mudslide to get initiated, and then now when that happens, so that we can get some estimate. And also when it happens, what is the flow dynamics and what would be the run out? Because that's important too. If it happens, you want to avoid the impact of it, and if you want to evacuate, but for that you need to know the flow dynamics and the run out of such material, which we can, now that we have the rheological understanding, we can solve the associated Navier-Stokes equations and understand the flow dynamics and run out.
Okay, and then in principle, what you would do would be like add large particles gradable to zones in a mudslide. I'm just thinking how to apply this. How to control it.
Okay. Yeah, actually, yeah, I mean, there is a rheological measurement. Usually, I mean, most of the results that I've shown are with model suspensions, because I was interested in understanding the fundamentals and how it works first before experimenting with real fluids, because real life is really not perfect and very challenging. So, but yeah, that in principle, that's the case.
Okay. Does anybody has other questions? Yes, I keep asking. Okay. Oh, so it's repeat. You said you had another meeting at 4?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, no, that's why I said we can skip over. No, but then thank you very much for giving a talk on the seminar series. Again, I wish you could have visited campus, but these are the times. So thanks again, and thank you again, everybody, for attending. And we'll see you at our next seminar. That maybe you're going to the in-person one. Yeah.
Thanks very much for having me, and thanks everyone. Have a good evening, everyone.